I wanted to welcome everybody and thank our speakers today from the Data Management and Analytics Center. You may have joined us in October when they talked about beyond the survey, exploring some qualitative research methods. But today we're going to be talking about survey design and something that I'm pretty interested in, which is Qualtrics. So I will turn things over to Mandy and Margaret, and then we'll do some Q&A after.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today, and in particular, thanks for having us back. I'm Margaret Bellick. I'm the director of the Center for Human Services Research. I'll let Mandy introduce herself.
I'm Mandy Breen. I'm a research scientist here at the Center for Human Services Research, and in particular, I am our survey and Qualtrics guru.
And we're excited to talk with you today. Now, as Tyler mentioned, we've previously talked about defining and refining our research topic and different options for research data collection, particularly for qualitative data. But let's say that you've decided that a survey would be the best mechanism for reaching your audience and capturing relevant data. So today we're going to focus on creating the best survey that you can and talk a bit about implementing your survey in Qualtrics. So today we'll touch on the basic principles of survey structure and design, some design choices that you might make. We'll talk a little bit about the impact of technology on these general survey principles, particularly for online and mobile methods, and some considerations for Qualtrics. To note from the start, we're not here to sell Qualtrics. UAlbany has an enterprise license already. It's already available to you for free, so there's mostly nothing to buy. But we use it a lot, and we find it to be a pretty solid product and pretty easy to get started in. But there are a few quirks to note and a few nice things to take advantage of too. So we'll hopefully give you a little bit of information to get you just started in where to look within Qualtrics for some cool stuff. All right, so let's start with that basic principles component. We've got two main subtopics here: common survey issues and solutions, and then improving responses to open ends. Some of the points we bring up might be obvious to you, which is fine, but we see these issues a lot even among our smart and competent colleagues, so they're worth talking about and going over, even if you already know something about how to design a survey. But generally speaking, when you start putting together a survey, there's a couple of big questions to ask yourself before you get into specific strategies. So first, for each item, you need to think about the information you want to get out of it and how you'll analyze it later. You want to have a plan for each item in your survey. You don't ask questions when you're not really sure what you'll do with it. It's not a great use of respondents' time. You might not do a great job asking a question in a way that's going to be useful later because you didn't know what you would use it for. So make sure each item and each question that's on your survey has a point and is going towards something, so you know how to use it well. Second, think about how a question could be answered in ways that you don't want, or how a reasonable person might still misinterpret your question and not answer how you want them to. These other ways of answering can mess up your data and mess up your interpretations, or just make it really hard to interpret what people actually mean by their selections. So you want to try to anticipate these possibilities and see what you can do to minimize them. And that's what some of these tips that we'll be sharing are aimed at doing. But every time you put together a new question, a new survey, this is something to think about. How can people break this so I can think about how to make it better so that it's at least harder for someone to reasonably misinterpret. So let's set the stage for our common survey issues with this particular setup. This is based on a project that we did a few years ago. So the examples are pretty close to real life. We worked with an organization that was providing legal services to clients. And then 6 months later, we needed to follow up with them to determine everyone's satisfaction with those services, to determine any long-term outcomes, and then their feelings about the legal system in general. So given that example, let's look at several common issues and think about how to shift the questions to ask them better and avoid these pitfalls. And I'll note for some of these, I'm going to present a situation, scenario, and then ask what you think we should do about it. So please unmute yourself and just chime in with your ideas. We'll see if we can get some audience participation going. All right, first type of issue is having mismatched questions and response items. So this is something like asking, did this organization help you resolve your legal case? And the responses that people can select being strongly disagree, disagreed, neither, agree, strongly agree. These don't really go together. If I'm saying, did the organization help me resolve my legal case? I agree that they did. I disagree that they helped. What's going on with my case? Think about it. If this were an open-ended item where someone just had a free response, how would I want them to answer? And then, okay, how can I use that to guide what my response options should be? So for this sort of question, what do you think the response options should actually be?
Maybe yes and no.
Yeah, just did they help? Yes or no? So this one can be pretty simple. But also consider, are there any other type of response options that we need to capture? So yes and no is the right start, but could someone's legal case be ongoing? Could it have not ended yet? Well, it could be, well, they're being really helpful to help me resolve my legal case, but my legal case isn't done yet. So do I say yes because they've been helpful, or do I say no because it's not done yet? So you just need an option that says case is ongoing. Because in this case, we know these cases probably often aren't done within 6 months. You might know that every single time this is going to be done within 6 months. I don't need that third option. So in this case, yes, they helped, no, they didn't help, or case is ongoing. And that makes sure that the question and the items that they're selecting from the answer options actually match with each other. Another type of issue can be double-barreled questions. So these are hard to answer. If you have a question like, was your lawyer friendly and helpful? If I'm like, well, my lawyer wasn't warm and fuzzy, but they were super helpful. How do I answer? Do I pick yes? But do I pick no because they didn't meet both of those conditions? Do I pick yes because they at least met one? So this both means as a respondent, I don't know how to answer. It also means later on when you're analyzing the data, you don't know which of these things is true or not true. So it's tricky on both ends. So what should we do instead? When you want to know both of these things, what would be a better setup for questions?
Could you separate out each section? So one for how friendly was the lawyer, and then the other one, how helpful were they?
Absolutely. And this is whenever you've got an and in there, think about, can this and should this be separate items, or are they always true together or always not true together? Another issue can be non-exhaustive response options. So we ask a question, on average, how often did you talk with your assigned lawyer? Oh, I talk to them once a month, once a week, once a day. What else would options be here? Well, what if I talk to my lawyer twice a week? What if I talk to them multiple times a day? What if I talk to them less than these? So I have some options here, but they're not covering the full spectrum of what responses should be. So what would some better response options be for this type of question?
Would ranges work?
Yes. So two things here. One is using ranges. So saying this to that. And one is making sure you have an other please specify option in there. So the first option, once a month or less, almost every day or more, a few times a week, a few times a month, a few times a week. So it's fuzzier, but we're capturing the full end, and we've got our extremes covered by that, or less or more, or going 1 to 2 times, 3 to 5 times, 6 to 10 times, other please specify. So if you talk to your lawyer 50 times, I'm like, look, it's not worth putting a response category that goes up to 50 because you are so far of an outlier. I know it should usually just be, up to a couple of times. Just put in an other please specify. That makes sure that anyone who has a really different experience has a place to put in that information and isn't left going like, well, I don't fit any of these, so how do I answer? You also want to make sure that your response scales are all symmetrical. You don't want them to be asymmetrical. So if the question is how helpful was your assigned lawyer, and your options are super helpful, very helpful, somewhat helpful, not helpful, you've got 3 pretty positive answer choices and 1 negative. That's uneven. That's biased towards getting a positive response. You want to make sure you have the same number of positive and negative options. So usually we go from like very helpful to very unhelpful, making sure that you're going the same number of items on either side of neutral, and as similarly far out on either side of neutral, to make sure you're not biasing people to say more positive or more negative answers than they might otherwise actually feel.
Great. Oh, is it all right if I ask a
Yeah.
quick question?
Sure, go for it.
Thanks. Okay, so I noticed you have neither helpful nor unhelpful in there, and I have heard, oh, you're smiling, so I think you know what I'm about to say. I've
Yep.
heard so many mixed things, and I have to admit, I personally dislike that option and will leave it out if I have the choice to. But I was wondering if, if you could weigh in from, from your experience and your perspective.
Mandy, do you want to take this one? Because I know you have strong thoughts and feelings about
I
this.
do. Yeah, so the research on this is extremely mixed. You could find something that supports either perspective. Both have, a lot of different experiments have gone into whether or not you should have that midpoint. And we do have a slide on this later. I have a tendency to recommend using the midpoint. I know proponents of not using one like it because it's forcing an opinion. So you get someone to stake a claim to they were at least on the helpful side or the unhelpful side. The problem with that is if someone legitimately has absolutely no opinion, they did not find them really helpful, they didn't find them unhelpful, they just don't really care. So kind of the choice you need to do when you're setting up your own survey and thinking about your analysis is, do you think it's a legitimate choice? And if you're pushing someone who doesn't really have an opinion towards making an opinion, is a little bit of noise one way or the other going to, offset your analysis in some way that it's like supposed to be very sensitive towards figuring out how helpful people were? Will this little bit of uncertainty there where you're pushing people, is that going to really impact the analysis that you plan to do? So having an opinion on it is half the battle on this one. You kind of don't have a right or wrong answer, but that's my experience and what I would push you to consider when making that choice.
Thank you.
Yeah, so could a reasonable person be kind of neutral? Doesn't matter if you push someone, that little bit of noise or uncertainty, is it gonna hurt your analyses? And then would pushing someone make them more likely to skip the item? And is that okay with you? Or make them more likely to drop out? And is that okay? If you're like, I just don't care, I don't know, and I don't care, am I as a respondent more likely to be like, I'm done with all of this and close out of the survey? Especially if you force a response to an item where I really don't have an opinion. But if you're like, no, a reasonable person should probably have an opinion about this, then it makes sense to maybe not include that neutral option.
Thank you. I appreciate your input.
Yeah. All right. Couple more components here. Want to also note the issue of overlapping scales. So if we ask people, what's your age? And we give them these options, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. What does your 40-year-old pick? It's in 2 of those options. Which one should I go for? So when you're putting together your response categories, you want to make sure that they don't overlap with each other. So that, again, as a respondent, it's really easy for me to pick which category and which response option makes the most sense. I don't have to think about, oh, wait, which one of these should I go for? Do I feel like I'm an old 40 or a young 40? And that's really difficult for some respondents to figure out. Also want to put in a note about reference periods. This isn't one where there's a mistake that people are making, but it's a choice you need to figure out based on what's going to make sense for your survey and for your project. So Generally, there's a greater accuracy with a shorter or a more recent reference period. So how often did you communicate with your assigned lawyer in the past 6 months versus the past month? It's a lot easier for me to count back and be like, okay, just in November, how many times versus the past 6 months? I'm like, wait, how long ago is 6 months? How far back do I have to go? I guess it was about this many times a month. I'm not quite sure. If you want to know about the long period, that's actually what your question's about, that's fine. But know that the information you get is going to be fuzzier. If you want a really specific count, a more recent and shorter reference period is going to be more likely to give that to you. But there are times when it's appropriate to go further back and have a longer reference period. This might be for items with lower base rates, things that occur less frequently that really might not have happened in the past month or even the past 6 months, going back maybe a year at least. Or for more sensitive items where you say, okay, let's just leave this a little bit more open and let people fill it in themselves. So if you want to know something about spanking, you might first have a question that says, have you ever spanked your children? And then if yes, asked, okay, about how many times have you ever spanked your children? So this is a very long time period, but this might be something that happens pretty infrequently. And you probably don't need to know the exact number. The difference between 20 times and 25 times is not going to matter to you. But the difference between just a couple and 10 is probably meaningful. And then if you put a reference time on that, about how many times did you spank your child in the past year or month, maybe it didn't happen in the past month, maybe even in the past year. So this is really something where you're going to have to figure out based on your question, your population, and exactly what you need to know. Again, this isn't a right or wrong way to do it, but it's something really important to keep in mind when setting up your questions. A couple other items we just want to note. Obviously, it's good to avoid technical jargon or abbreviations. You want to avoid double negatives. They're just a little bit more cognitively difficult to work through. And you generally want to make your items as easy to answer as possible. You want this to be easy for your respondent to read your items, answer, and keep moving on through the survey. We also want to note a little bit about the importance of question framing. So the wording of the questions themselves can lead participants to respond in certain directions or bias their responses. So for example, I'll show some kind of extreme examples, but to get the point across. You want to not induce social desirability in your question framing. So if you say, we're conducting this survey as part of a program to reduce drinking in excess, please answer these items according to your drinking habits. Well, you said drinking in excess, and everyone's like, well, that's pretty bad. So I don't drink that much. Let's lower my responses a little bit so I don't look like I'm doing something that's socially undesirable. You want to make sure you don't have a really clear valence of an obviously right answer that you're looking for in your responses. So if you say this program has been implemented to improve services, please respond according to your experience with services. Generally, people are like, well, it's meant to help. So let's say it's helping. You've told them it's meant to help. They want to support a thing that's supposed to be helping. Also, if you put in a link to authority in your question framing, if you say, the new vice president for research supports this plan, please answer the following items and your opinions of this plan, you're probably going to say, these all sound like great ideas, or at least more likely to rate them a little bit more positively than you might have otherwise, because some relevant authority figure has already endorsed this component. You also, a little bit counterintuitively, want to avoid comments about the sensitivity of a topic. So if you say something like, the next questions ask about experiences of domestic violence or abuse. I know this topic might be sensitive. Please just give your best answer if you can. This feels like the right thing to do as a person because you want to note, hey, this might be sensitive for you, it's okay. But this might induce sensitivity where otherwise there wasn't any and induce a little bit of social pressure. It's actually better to note the topic, but otherwise be really bland and not say anything about whether or not something's sensitive. Let the respondent decide for themselves if it's sensitive for them. You don't need to decide that for them. So in contrast to doing those things, you generally want to keep your question introductions and transitions to a minimum. You want to be brief, be bland, and be balanced. So just say the following questions ask about your drinking habits. Please answer according to your habits. Or for sensitive items, you might want to use that intro to lower the threat level. You're not telling anyone, hey, there's something sensitive here, but you're giving a little bit more setup so that if someone has some other feelings about this topic, they've got the intro and space to note it and feel safe answering. So if you say feeling unsafe at home can happen to anyone. Have you ever felt unsafe at home or with a partner? You're not saying this next question is about domestic violence. Some people find it sensitive. You're just saying this situation can exist. Has this ever happened to you? But you're not alone if it has, because this can happen to anyone. Or saying even the calmest parents get angry at their children some of the time. How often did you get angry with your children in the past week? You've lowered the threat level and made it feel like it's okay to admit if you have gotten angry with your children in the past week, because that's a pretty normal experience as well. All right, so now let's talk for a minute about open-ended items, and then we'll flip to Mandy and you'll get a different speaker for a little bit at least. So open ends are those free response text entry items, and they are tricky. They're always tough to get good responses to, but they are harder to get good responses to for smartphones. Open ends generally increase the likelihood of respondent dropout. It's a lot easier to click on a button and move on than to think of my own answer, come up with it and type it out, especially since I am the world's worst smartphone typist. And I already always have so many typos. I'm like, do I go back to fix this? Do I just say screw it and move on? And it's tough to get other people who maybe have less, pull to just answer your survey to really do them well. So what should you do? First, minimize the number of open ends. How many things do you really not already have good categories or answers for? Where do you really critically need that qualitative open-ended input? And keep it only to those items. We also suggest trying to reserve them for the end of the survey where you can, so that if someone gets to it and drops out, they haven't missed all of the rest of your survey at least. You probably want to let respondents skip them. So don't make them a forced response or a required response. Because again, that's more likely to make someone quit versus just like, it's too much work to just think of my own words, I'll just move on to the next thing. And you want to add motivating text to the question, telling me, why should I bother trying to think of my own answer for this? And then make sure that data is usable. When someone actually does answer, you want to make sure that it's usable, that it's not invalid, and that also you can use it without a huge amount of work on your end. So if there's built-in validation that you can put in, if you're expecting numbers, you want to make sure that you're getting numbers in your response. Or you can provide an example, especially on formatting. So for example, if we ask, when did you begin your legal case? What do you want? Do you want a year? Do you want the exact date, which I may or may not remember? Do you want 2018 versus 18 versus June 2018 versus all of the different ways of showing a date? Give an example. So a little bit more specific, please provide the month and year in which you began your legal case. For example, 6/2018. Most people will at least follow your format. Not all of them, you'll have to do some recoding by hand, but at least it'll be less recoding by hand when you've given a format. Second, for that idea of motivating text, if you just say, please describe how your lawyer was helpful or unhelpful, that's a lot of work for me to think of and come up with words about exactly how my lawyer was helpful or unhelpful. Instead, you can do something that's a little bit more staged. So if you ask someone first, how satisfied were you with the support provided by your lawyer? Very satisfied to very dissatisfied. And then follow up. So for everyone who says somewhat or very dissatisfied, have the follow-up question be, you indicated that you were somewhat dissatisfied with the support provided. Can you tell us more about this? Your answer will help us adjust our services better for future clients. So this works a lot better for a few reasons. One, I've already done some thinking to determine if my lawyer was satisfactory or unsatisfactory. So I'm not just jumping cold into this next item to give an answer, I've already done some of the thinking, so it'll be easier for me to come up with my own words to describe why I think that. Second, you've told me why I should bother answering this and how you will use the information that I'm giving you. Your answer will help us adjust our services better for future clients. I'm like, okay, I guess it's worth me putting in a little bit more effort because you'll be using this to make sure things go smoother for other people in the future. And that's much more motivating than please just tell me a thing. All right, so that's a whole bunch on some common issues and some ideas about how to ask your questions better. But there are still other pieces here about design. And I'll let Mandy take it for the next section.
So next, I want to talk to you a little bit about design choices. And I really want to highlight the word choices here because everything we're giving are recommendations based on the experience, the exact survey that you might be trying to run, or the data that you need, but there's no like perfect answer that's right every time that we can say always use a middle point or never use a middle point. It really depends on what you need out of each and every survey and project. So first we're going to look into question order and how that can affect how respondents move through your survey. We'll look at the forcing of responses. Do you or do you not want to push them to answer every question? And then we're going to look at response scale lengths a little bit, including that midpoint. And then, do we recommend 5 or 7 point scales, things like that. You can move forward. Thank you. You should really open with that informational or consent language that clearly explains your topic and the purpose of your survey. This is in part to motivate your respondent to actually, continue clicking in your survey. If you don't have some interesting topic information and it just lists for them, like, we promise not to share your information and this will take you 30 minutes, they might just kind of bounce because that sounds terrible and you haven't given them a reason to stick around. So you want to start with that, especially because that consent language can sometimes be, required in a very particular way by the IRB. But also just to make sure that they know everything they need to know up front and are still willing to participate. You don't want them to get in 2 or 3 questions to sort of get their buy-in and then have them drop out because the survey isn't what they thought it was going to be. You also want to respect respondents' time by doing the screening questions next. I really harp on this one a little bit because, we're asking a lot of respondents to just kind of out of the goodness of their heart or maybe for the chance of a gift card to take our survey for us. And so you want to make sure that you're being really respectful of their time and also respectful of your time. You're, eventually going to need to do the data analysis for this, and you don't want to do that for respondents that aren't relevant to you. So if you need people that are only within the age group 18 to 36, in the first couple questions, you need to ask them what their age group is so that you can screen out the people that aren't relevant to you, and then you can continue with just the people that fall within that age group. The first items after screening also need to be really relevant and kind of interesting. Obviously, a lot of surveys aren't super interesting, but something a little bit more engaging than just what's your zip code? Do you like blue? That's not going to get people to continue with your survey. So you need to put something that's topic relevant up front that keeps them interested a little bit. And that's applicable to everyone. You don't want to get really complicated in your skip logic up front if you can help it, so that you know that you're catching everyone with the same questions. And definitely do not put an open-ended question up front. People will just drop out immediately, and I will be the first to admit that I will. If you give me a survey that immediately asks me to give my thoughts on the universe, I don't have enough buy-in yet, and I just don't want to put my time into that. So I skip out. You don't want people skipping out on you. Try and make it easy and interesting for them to get in a little bit. And once you have your foot in the door, you can push them a little bit more. And where do you put your demographic questions? We get this question all the time. There's not a perfect answer here, because if you put them at the beginning, it's not as relevant or interesting, and sometimes can be a turnoff, especially if they get a little bit specific. Sometimes if you want to ask people things like their income up front, they might feel nervous. They haven't built any trust or buy into the survey. And so they might think, I'm not really into this, I'm going to leave. But then if you do it at the end, maybe people get bored by the end of your survey and they don't stick around for your demographics, and that might impact how you go about the analysis. So you have to kind of weigh what will my respondents stick around for in the beginning, but also what do I have to have for my analysis? If there's something that will make your analysis completely irrelevant, if it's not answered, then make sure that that's upfront so that you, again, are only going through the whole survey, both for the respondent and yourself, with people that are going to give you usable data. So despite the like either or there, we really do recommend the end. It's just less off-putting for people, and they're more likely to kind of quickly click through them at the end because we're a little bit trained now to recognize demographics usually mean the end of the survey. A lot of people will even put a tiny blurb that says, now just a couple demographic questions and then you're done. That will help people stick around for those couple of questions that don't really require any cognitive effort, so it's easy to just finish up with you. We also recommend grouping similar items together when using similar response scales. So if you've got 5-point Likert scales, try and group those all into one section so it's cognitively easier for the respondent to go through them rather than having to go back and forth between this scale is about satisfaction, this scale is about agreement, now back to satisfaction. That can get very confusing. People will trip up or get annoyed, and they might put less effort into answering the questions. I want to note that sometimes this isn't possible because you might have a validated scale that needs to be asked in a certain order, and it might go back and forth between different response options. That's okay. Definitely don't break a validated scale to follow this recommendation. This is, as possible, we recommend it. And I'll ask your general question first, then get more specific. This sometimes seems counterintuitive, but I want to walk you guys through an idea here. So if I ask, how satisfied were you on your last call with your assigned lawyer? Let's say that was just the worst call you've ever had with a human being. You remember it very strongly. It was terrible. Then when I ask you next, how satisfied were you with that lawyer overall? It's so fresh in your mind that you've had this very terrible experience that you might say, you know, overall, I think they were kind of bad. I don't really like them. That's what's most present in my mind. And so that's how I'm going to answer. But if we flip the question, it doesn't have that same impact. So when you ask how satisfied were you with your lawyer overall first, it allows people to think over the longer range of time that they've been interacting with this person. It's not calling them to anything specific, so they're doing a better job of thinking big picture. Then when you move on to ask the specific, how was your last call? They've already answered that big picture question for you. You don't have to worry about biasing that. They can get into the nitty gritty and really think back and go, oh yeah, that one in particular was really bad. So they have the opportunity to show you or to share with you both sides of it, that they had good overall, but bad recent interactions. And the two haven't impacted each other. They haven't biased each other in any way. I also just want to note really quickly that some of our questions are going to be really dull. And so I always recommend people leave those for later. I didn't mention that earlier, but that's something that, like, if you're really trying to figure out where to put a question and it is boring, maybe push it towards the end a little bit so that upfront people are like buying in a little bit better. So forcing responses, again, is a question we get a lot. And that forced response means, are we making them answer this question? Before we move forward, do they have to answer this no matter what? Doing so can cause dropout because if I don't have a response, or if maybe you haven't designed this question perfectly and it doesn't give me a response option that feels appropriate for me, and I have to answer it, what do I do? Do I give you noise? Do I answer a thing that doesn't matter for me? Do I just leave because this discussion is making me uncomfortable, trying to figure out, like, this answer doesn't work for me? So your data quality might end up worse for forcing that response. But if you do let people skip all of your questions, that might invalidate your data. You might not have anything useful from that respondent because they skipped most of your most important questions. So it's really a balancing act of what do you need out of this survey, and what can you do without when you're doing your analysis. So some things to consider are, what items do you need for that filtering and screening to make sure that these are the right participants for you? Those you might consider forcing a response for. What items are critical for your analysis, like I said, or for further future questions. If you're going to need to decide how to show response or questions to somebody based on how they responded earlier, you might consider forcing a response. Is it reasonable that someone might want to skip this one? Is it an open end that's kind of boring? Do you think people might skip that one? Or do you think that this might be really difficult or something people don't think about much or might be uncomfortable with, such as spanking their children? So that's something people might reasonably want to skip, and you want to give them that opportunity. Or conversely, is don't know a valid option that you could give them instead to kind of bridge that gap for them in a different way rather than having them skip? Or can you remind a participant to respond, but not make them respond? So in Qualtrics, you can do this where a pop-up will tell them, hey, you forgot to answer question number 3. And then they get to choose if they want to click next. They can still move forward without answering that question. But it will bring them back to it, highlight which one they haven't answered in case maybe that was a mistake that they didn't answer it. One important thing to note here when considering forcing response is if you did go through an IRB for this project, if you are considering forcing a response that you didn't force in your submission to the IRB, you might have to submit an amendment to them to say this is a question that we want to force a response to. Also, in your consent language, this is important to the IRB too. If you've said to respondents that they don't have to answer any question that they don't want to, but then you force a response, you are in fact making them answer questions that they may not want to answer. So you have to kind of weigh what's most important, and definitely don't have forced responses if your consent language promises not to force them. So you can just modify your consent language if in fact you need to force some things to just explain that maybe you'll be giving them don't know options if they're not comfortable, or you can even give them an answer choice that says don't want to respond, rather than just letting them skip and not knowing why that's happening, but it allows them not to answer as you've promised. Survey choices length is a big one. To be honest with you, we fight with people about this all the time. Think back to the last survey you took. Was it longer than you wanted? Probably. How long was it? Only 4 minutes and still longer than you wanted? That's how we all feel. We really just need to make these as short as possible because people don't have time, they don't have the buy-in, and the longer you make them stick around, kind of the less cognitive effort they're going to be putting into your question. So you might not be getting as good quality data by the end of it. Paid participants, I'm not sure if any of you go this route, but they'll last longer. Usually they'll stick it out more than somebody who's entirely voluntarily taking this survey. Similarly, if you're offering incentives, people might stick around a little bit longer if you promise that when they finish completion, they will get the incentive or they'll be entered into a raffle to get that incentive. But even they will drop out at a certain point. So you want to make sure you're not reaching that point. Qualtrics estimates time for you. It's a very generic kind of estimation. It's helpful as a starting point, but we find it can be fairly inaccurate sometimes depending on all of the skip logic or branch logic that you might use. So we really recommend that you use pilot testing. And this shouldn't be just with colleagues. This should be people in the demographic that you're hoping to survey, people who don't know about the project, if at all possible. That way you can get a better estimation of how long it takes them to actually go through those questions. We get questions too about attention checks. That's a question like this one you see on the screen that says, what color is grass? And then gives them the obviously correct answer and obviously incorrect answers. This is basically to see, are people paying attention? And we don't recommend this because it's kind of obnoxious. I, as the respondent, might kind of stop and think like, do you think I'm dumb? Are you trying to trick me? Do you think I'm not paying attention? I don't feel respected. And so I might not want to continue, or I might start being a little more flippant with my responses. There's also some demographic biases that can be entered here. Fascinatingly enough, there's an age bias, and I had to kind of look into this one a little bit because it wasn't immediately obvious to me what that bias would be. And it turns out that younger people more often fail attention checks than older people. And so you might be resulting in, your choices might be resulting in worse data later on if you're, say, dropping everyone who failed the attention check, because now maybe you've gotten rid of all of your young people. And so your data is going to skew towards older people, older respondents, and you might not get the same picture if you included everyone. So the option that we offer instead is to reverse code items. That's where you would phrase one question in the negative rather than the positive. So if most of your questions have been, how much did you like your lawyer? The next one would be, how terrible was your lawyer? Clearly, those are not nuanced questions, but the idea is to kind of see if your respondent is paying attention without bringing to their attention the fact that you're testing them at all. That way, you can see if people are straight lining, which is if they just go through and click, you know, loved my lawyer for every single question, or if they're just being kind of careless with responses. You should be able to tell if this question and the negatively worded question aren't following the same vein, then you know something's up and you can look a little bit deeper into that response. So response scales, just like that midpoint, there's not great data on either side that says 5 is definitely better than 7. There's no, like I said, neutral or a midpoint or no midpoint is better. It's really up in the air. It's kind of up to you. Like I said, with the midpoint, we do have an opinion. We tend to err on the side of the 5-point scale as opposed to the 7, because it's easier cognitively to think about a lower number. What's the difference between 6 and 7? It might not be that clear to people. Also, there are some really interesting biases that research has found, where people are more likely to use the extremes in certain instances. So this one research paper found that if they used a 10-point scale for rating instructors, they found that people only used the highest ratings for men, not for female instructors. But if they reduced that 10-point scale down to a 6-point scale, that gap entirely vanished. So there was something about that 10-point scale that was making people evaluate female and male instructors differently that maybe wasn't true to their actual opinions. So things like that too can kind of sneak up on you. And so if there's something to pull from the research on if a 5 or 7-point scale is better for a particular topic, it's always good to look for that and try and incorporate that into your design. So when you have the option to use tech, like using Qualtrics, use it to the fullest ability that you can. With Qualtrics or other platforms like SurveyMonkey, you can do things like skip patterns or branch logic. These things will allow you to skip questions that aren't relevant for particular respondents. So for example, if a respondent says that their highest level of schooling was a master's degree, you can ask them a question about what their master's degree was in. If somebody said that their highest level of schooling was high school, you don't want to ask what their degree was in because they don't have one. So this allows you to skip past things that are irrelevant because 1, that makes it faster for your respondent to go through the survey, and 2, It's less confusing and annoying for the respondent. If the question isn't relevant to them, they can get kind of frustrated because they don't know how to answer it. And we know that if you're doing maybe some of your surveys online through Qualtrics and some have to be on paper because you need to do them in person, you obviously can't use skip patterns on that paper survey. But when given the opportunity, we recommend you take that. Also use drag and drop ranking instead of just numbering. This is something that Qualtrics allows where you can literally just click and drag rather than in this first example, you see where you'd have to enter in by hand. Red is my least or my most favorite. That's the number 1. Purple is my second. Then you have to kind of figure out what numbers you've used and not used. It's so much easier with the dragging and dropping because it reorders the numbers for you every time. So you just have to make sure they're in the right order and the rest is done for you. And then when that data is exported for you later on, it's also much easier to analyze because it's all of that has been done for you up front.
All right. So we were just getting into the technology side of things with using it well, but let's also talk for a minute about some other elements of technology to keep in mind, particularly when trying to make surveys that also work well on smartphones. So first, at this point, I think we're basically all aware that every online survey is also a mobile survey, especially as many people at this point only have smartphones and no computers. This is probably less true for college students if that's who you're trying to survey, but if you go outside that population, you're likely to see this issue. So assume that every online survey will also be taken on smartphones and try to optimize for that too. But what does phone optimization mean? To some extent, some platforms, Qualtrics included, will do this for you. There's a mobile-friendly option, or you can preview something on a phone to make sure it'll look okay. But there are a couple of other pieces that you might need to do by hand. So for one, you need to think about scale, length, and orientation. So if I have a scale where I need you to rate something from 1 to 10. I'm specifically using something where there's a lot of scale points here that might go off my screen, or I might need to scroll to the side to see those options. First, that's annoying, and I might not want to do it. Second, I might not realize that there are more points. If you actually have these ordered from 1 to 5, and then 6 to 7 are off the screen, or 6 to 10 are off the screen, I might not even realize that this scale could have gone to 10. I'll pick 5 because I want the most, when actually I should have picked 10. I didn't even know it was an option. So you might want to consider using a vertical scale. Up and down is a lot easier than side scrolling on a phone, and it'll get you the same information. So minimize scrolling, minimize open ends, because like I said, they're especially annoying to type on a phone, and some of your respondents, like me, might be especially bad at it. You also may want to make sure that all of your images are scaled correctly. So you don't want to do this, where part of your image just goes off the screen. So make sure that, again, if there's a built-in option to your platform, that it'll do some automatic resizing and rescaling for you, or that you're using images that are appropriately sized and scaled. All right. So let's say now your survey is perfectly designed. It's maybe even perfectly set up in Qualtrics. Now you need to get people to take it. So how do you get people to take your survey? How do you distribute it? What are some options that you use? I've put up an in-person paper survey as one option. You might bring it to classes, you might leave stashes in strategic places, you might hand out in a lobby or at a family court waiting room. But how else do you distribute a survey? I've just noticed that a couple of people, oh, okay, that chat wasn't for us. Great. But please chime in. How else do you distribute a survey? Everyone only does in-person paper surveys. You don't do any other form of survey distribution.
We've done pop-up web surveys on our website.
Yep. So that's online. When someone goes to your website, maybe something pops up, please take our survey. Great.
in the chat, people are saying things like email links, listservs. Twitter.
Yep, using social media.
I'm gonna go obvious here, and iPhone. I do a lot of phone surveying in my work.
QR codes. Stick a QR code on a flyer.
Yeah.
Right. I'll put up a couple more things. You can also mail your surveys out. It's paper, but it's not in person, but you can do a mailing distribution. As Mandy said, you can call people over the phone and ask them items on your survey. And then some of the more technology ones, you can email a link to a survey, you can send individual links to people, or you can use one general anonymous link. You can put a survey link on a flyer, you can put a QR code on a flyer, you can put a QR code on a sticker, you can put a QR code on a whole bunch of other stuff. Post a link on social media. You can also do some texting stuff. You can text a link to an online survey, and you can text back and forth survey questions themselves, and we'll talk about those in a minute. But I want to note here, I've kind of organized these as less to more technology, but none of these are bad options. As we noted, we do stuff in the first column. We do in-paper surveys. We mail stuff out. We do a lot of phone surveys. Less technology isn't bad here. It just depends on who you're trying to reach and how is going to be best to get in touch with them. We know who we need to call to get surveys done. We have a contact list, so we should just call them and see if we can get them to do it. If you don't know who you need to get in touch with, you need something where it's going to be more mass distribution, hit a lot of people at once, post some flyers up, post something on social media and see who responds, or how it gets passed around and snowballs. So some of them are going to depend on if you have a captive audience or a client list versus you don't and you need a general population, or also time. It takes a lot of time to do phone surveys. In some cases, they're really effective, but they're time consuming and you might not have that time. So none of these are bad, but let's talk a little bit about that second column of how you might want to optimize for emails or for texting. All right. I'll also note, I know we're running a little bit long on time. Apparently we had a lot to say today. We've got a little bit more, but obviously we're recording this. So if someone needs to go, we do understand. All right, let's talk a little bit about engagement through email. The first step is getting someone to open your email. You want to try to distribute your email from a recognizable source. So if there's some official name, if we send something from CHSR or Center for Human Services Research at albany.edu, that's a bit better than my personal email at Albany, and it's a lot better than a Gmail address, which feels very anonymous and not official. You also want to try to make sure that your subject line is credible and appealing enough to open. So recognizable organization name, research study is better than money for completing survey. Generally, you want to, in your subject line, stay away from the word survey and call it a research study. Survey feels scammy and it feels like this isn't an official real thing. Research study feels a little bit more formal and credible. But also feeling nothing's going to be perfect here. It's hard to get people to click the link to open a survey through email, especially if they don't already have some buy-in or really know who you are and why they should be answering. In the email itself, you need to do a whole lot in as few words as possible. You need to give the topic, the purpose, the sponsorship, information for informed consent, and then get people to actually participate. So here's a kind of long example, but from that legal services case study. So dear name, okay, we've got personalization there. A few months ago, you received some legal help from organization, hope you're doing well. Organization is working with a team of researchers at SUNY Albany. That's a little like, hey, look, we're an official affiliation. You should trust us because we're coming from a group that you know. The team would like to follow up with you to learn more about your, ask some questions about your experience and notes so we can do our work better. Okay, that's a little bit of motivating text as well. As a thank you for your time, we'll mail you a $10 Target gift card incentive. Okay, I want $10 to Target. Survey will take about 10 minutes. It's confidential. No one will have access to your information other than the research team. Okay, we've got all of our consent type information. All right, then the link, if you've got any questions. And then we also differentiate here for this particular group. If you have any questions about this survey, contact me. If you have any questions, if you need additional legal help, call official group. We can't answer questions about legal help. We don't provide legal services. We don't know anything and we're not helpful. So we want to send people to the appropriate source to respond to your need, and make sure, come to us for the survey. Don't come to us with your legal questions just because we can't help you, and that's not going to be a good use of your time. All right, that's email. Let's think about those texting options for a minute because they're a little bit newer and shiny and exciting. So if you want to do text message surveys, you can, there we go. If you want to do texting-based question and answer surveys, it is available in Qualtrics. It does require purchase of an upgrade to the university's license. It's not a massive amount of money, but there is an extra fee that you have to pay in order to do it. We want to note, if you do texting surveys, it requires express consent to contact participants through this method. This is by FCC regulations. Consent can either be prearranged, so you can get consent on a consent form on a previous survey. If you have something on there that says, can we contact you for follow-up through text message or for a follow-up survey through text message, and you get someone to sign off on that, you're good. Or consent can be someone opting in themselves and texting you a key phrase first and then getting the survey in response. So either of those methods works for consent, but you need something here. You cannot just text a whole bunch of people your link to a survey and have it be okay. This one needs something prearranged or an explicit opt-in. But there's two main ways to do texting surveys. For one, you can text a link to the survey. So in this example, someone has texted whatever number, a key phrase, here it's feedback, and they get a response back from you automatically with a link to the survey. So in this case, they've opted in, so they've given consent, and then you can respond with the survey link. You can also just text someone the link if you have that prior consent. The other option is to take the survey itself through text, through texting back and forth. Here's a question, text and answer. Here's another question, text and answer. This is best for very simple surveys. So you can see the examples here. Which of these did you choose to drink with your buffet? Choose one, reply with a number. So all I have to do is type in 7 and enter that and send it back, and I've responded to the question. For this example, this is an example about it's like a customer feedback for T-Mobile. So there's a couple of, on a scale of 0 to 10, defining the endpoints here. What was your experience like? I know it's a little hard to read, but it's like a 9, a 3, and 8. And then there's a last open end. Please provide any additional feedback about your experience. And this person saying, I hate T-Mobile. Okay, I have no opinion on T-Mobile, but this person really does. You can also include a little bit of validation here. So again, using a 0 to 10 scale, how likely are you to recommend T-Mobile to your friends, family? Someone said 11. They get an automated response back. I'm sorry, your response was not recognized. Please check your response and try again. Okay, I can't give the joking 11 example, so I'll just say it was 10. Okay, great. So like I said, these are best for very simple surveys. You probably can't do, or you definitely can't do select more than one type item, and you want to keep it to very simple, just select one multiple choice, or maybe a few open ends, but they can still be really useful. Again, you need consent ahead of time. And simple, but it could still be useful for simple surveys, for participant check-ins between full instruments to validate contact information. Hey, are you still at this email address? Are you still at this phone number? Is this still you? Or maybe scheduling a full survey. Hey, it's time for our next check-in. We have availabilities at these times. Do you want to select any of them? Instead of sending out a link, or doing a call to arrange another call. All right, one last word on technology in general. Response rates really vary between methods, generally in person, in the mail, email, phone, texting, but it is likely shifting. So we don't want to put too much weight on that. It's really about your population, who you're trying to reach, and the time that you have to try these different methods. Your demographics might also be skewed. So SMS might be a really good way to reach minority low-income respondents who don't have other response options, but do have smartphones, in most cases, as their one piece of technology in order to be able to function in the world. So it depends, again, on who you want to reach. Also, the lack of any interviewer or any what feels like a proctor might lead to more honest answers on sensitive topics if you have an online link to a survey, or if you text out a short survey. So if you're asking people if you've ever been a victim of domestic abuse or violence, have you ever spanked your children, feeling like I don't have to give an answer to a real other person who might judge me, and my answer will just be one number amongst a sea of many other respondents' numbers, might take some pressure off of me and might make me feel like I can respond honestly. Right. Again, on strategies for participant engagement, incentives, they help. Money's best. If you can give people money for doing your survey, they're a lot more likely to do your survey. Sometimes the social reward is sufficient, but often it's not. How much money is really going to depend on your budget, if you have a budget for participant incentives. And then you also need to consider the balance of fairly compensating someone for their time and their effort and incentivizing participation, but also not exerting undue pressure or being coercive, especially for vulnerable populations. Even if you have the budget to pay $100 per survey respondent for a survey of domestic abuse victims and domestic violence victims, you might not want to. You might rather say, actually, let's go with a $20 to $25 incentive per survey response, because for that amount of money, okay, it's still definitely incentive. I'm much likelier to do it than without that incentive. But also, it's probably less likely that, man, that $100 would really mean a lot to me. That would really make a difference. I don't want to take the survey, but I really need that $100, so I'll respond. You never want to put someone in that position. You do want to make them feel like, you know, the survey is going to ask something of me, and so I should get a little something for my time if we can. But make sure it's just a fair amount. We also want to note, if you're doing a lottery draw for an incentive, you really want to do more smaller prizes instead of fewer larger prizes. You don't want to do 5 $100 gift certificates. You want to do 20 $25 gift certificates as your prizes. People won't feel like, oh, I could maybe get $100. They're going to feel like there's only 5 of those. My chances of getting it are basically nothing. Versus if it's like, oh, there's $105 prizes, I could probably be one of 100 people to do this. So they're actually a lot more likely to go for that smaller amount. So again, a smaller incentive in some cases is actually better than a bigger incentive, but any incentive is better than no incentive at all, if you can. All right, Mandy, I'll let you pick it back up.
Yes, now we're turning to some Qualtrics considerations, and there are a lot of Qualtrics considerations. So we're not going to go in depth into Qualtrics because we'd be here all day, and we've already been here a while. So we're going to go over some basic kind of quirks, things to keep in mind when you're starting out with Qualtrics. And then at the end, we will point out some resources, both with us and then with Qualtrics for future learning. We do want to note that Qualtrics is very user-friendly and that they have a lot of user support articles and videos. So it's something that really the cost to entry is pretty low. And again, we're not here to sell you on Qualtrics. You already have free access to Qualtrics, but I'm rather biased. I really like the platform. And I think most people that I've spoken to do as well once they've had a chance to kind of go in there and play around. So the first thing we're going to look at is exclusive answer choices. This is just something to keep in mind when you're designing your survey. If you have a question that is a select multiple question, then you might end up having something where if you click this one answer, none of the other answers should be clicked at the same time. Our example here is if you click none of the above, you want them to only be able to select that one because, let's think about that. If someone clicks both interviewing techniques as a training session they attended and that they attended none of the above training sessions, then how are you supposed to take that information and analyze it? Do you assume they didn't mean the first one, that they obviously meant none of the above? Do you assume the opposite? Hard to know. So you're pretty much going to have to drop that participant, which is a bummer. You've gone to this effort of getting your survey designed, implemented, you've gotten people to take it, and now you can't use the data. So the way that you go into Qualtrics to make this as an exclusive answer choice is that you click on that little down caret you see at the end of the response option, and you scroll down to where it says make answer exclusive. You just make sure that that's checked, and then you'll get that strange little asterisk you see in the left-hand side example there. And that will denote that you can only click that one, and you can't click it with any other combinations. Something else that you should know about is the ability to retake responses. So there are two different ways to do this in Qualtrics. The first is just called retake response. So this is to go into the response as it's already been entered, and you can change things. So everything will stay populated as it was originally answered. And let's say you maybe left off with a respondent, you can go back in and start where you left off without having to restart the entire survey. Or if you need to go in and edit something, maybe you entered an ID number incorrectly, you can go in and do that through this option. The second option is to retake as a new response. This means that this particular respondent will have all of their responses removed, and then they in particular get to take it a second time. So it will have their ID number affiliated with it through Qualtrics, but everything else is gone. So I want to just be, very obvious here. You have to be very cautious when using these two. You don't want to click the wrong one because you can invalidate your responses. You can lose all of the data that you have. So be careful here. The way you access this is to go into the data and analysis tab within a Qualtrics project. And then on the far right-hand side, there's a column titled Actions. You go down to the down caret again, that is part of the specific response that you want to edit, and it will give you this drop down of options that you see here. There's some built-in reporting in Qualtrics that is interesting to play around with, but we really recommend only using it if you want to display live data. What that means is that as responses come in, you can have a report set up that Qualtrics will update automatically so that you or any project partner can log into what is essentially a little dashboard, and you can see how things are changing as you gather more responses. For more complex things, we really just find that it's easier to export the data and use whatever program you're familiar with. This might be SPSS, Excel, SAS. You can just do more things with less clicks there. And so for the most part, that's what we recommend people to do. If you do go into that built-in reporting, we just want to mention one thing because it's often overlooked. When you go into a question and you're setting up some kind of report or graph on that specific question, there is, you need to click the question, and then on the right-hand side, the windows that you see here will pop up, giving you options to interact with that graph. If you do not click on the graph, these options are not there. So it might be very confusing about how you're supposed to interact and change anything with that graph. So make sure you click it. One other thing to keep in mind is that if you have a figure for a multiple answer item, you want to make sure that you're using the correct denominator, because you could have, one respondent pick multiple items for a survey, maybe in what counties in New York State have you lived in? Do you want to report that 110 people have lived in Albany, or do you want, and that might be more than the number of, no, I'm getting this a little bit confused, guys. I've gotten flustered. So let's say, I'm going to try and start over here. Let's say you have 100 respondents and 110 responses because people could select multiple counties. That's where you might get tripped up and want to make sure that you're choosing the right option here. You want to make sure you're use the respondent totals. If you're looking out of the 100 respondents, how many answered this particular way. You want to look at the choice totals if you want to just look at how many people in general chose Albany. And then you can also look at the percentages. So being careful here of choosing these choices on purpose and making sure that it's the right one represented. And like I said, we recommend that you export your final data set to do any real analyses. In Qualtrics, you can export into SPSS. That's the only statistical package that Qualtrics directly exports to. And by default in this version, multi-value fields are separated into columns. So you don't have one column that says they chose Albany and Suffolk and Queens. Those are each their own 0 or 1 column, which makes it easier to do that analysis. You can also do Excel or a CSV as an export. Those will by default put those multi-values into that single column, and so you'll have to separate them. Or if you remember, you can go into the more options section of doing that export, and it will allow you to checkbox an item that will separate them into those different columns. But you have to choose to do that. It does not do it by default. It also in Excel will include the variable labels or the variable values. It does not give you both. SPSS will give you both. CSV is better than Excel if you have a really large data set. It's also something that other statistical packages normally can import as, so that's a way to go. And then there are also TSV, XML, and Google Drive export options. This very strange thing that Qualtrics does is that they automatically exclude don't know and none of the above responses. So if you asked people if they've ever lived in any of these New York counties and they chose none of the above, it would just show up as they hadn't answered the question, essentially. So you need to go in manually, and we recommend doing this every time to uncheck that box, that little button you see that says exclude from analysis. You want to make sure that's not checked. That way, that data is going to always be downloaded for you, and you can make the choice of whether or not you want to include that. That way it's on you. You don't just kind of have this strange missing data. The way to see on quick glance if you have included or excluded anything in this nature is on that right or left side there. You see the little circle with the backslash. That means that that will not be exported. That's going to be excluded. So we basically just make sure there are none of those ever. So are you considering trying Qualtrics? A thing to know if you're going to is that you can import data into Qualtrics. So if you're already doing a survey or have done it previously and want to run a second iteration of it, you can put that into Qualtrics, import your existing data, and that way it's all in one place when you collect your new data. You can just export it all at the same time. If you wanted to use some of Qualtrics's reporting features, you could do that on your old data and the new data that you're collecting now. You can do that through a CSV or a TSV file, and it's pretty easy. Also, like we've said, you have free access to this. So we really recommend giving it a try. Why not? There's no cost associated. It is very user-friendly. And if you want to get started, I've included a link here. This is the wiki page for UAlbany that tells you how to get started. It's pretty simple. There's also a dedicated Qualtrics account that you can email at Albany. It's qualtrics@albany.edu. This person is well-trained in Qualtrics and is pretty quick to get back to you. She's not there to ask, answer questions like, when I click the button, the right thing doesn't happen. But if you have any problems with your account itself, she will help with that very quickly. So let's turn quickly to those resources, because I know we've taken up a lot of your time. So Qualtrics is a lot. Like I said, they've got just basic walkthroughs that are very simple, step-by-step with pictures for almost any process that you want to do with their platform. That's that first link there. We find most people find that that's enough to do the basic things at minimum, and some more complex things, skip logic, branching, things like that. They can mostly kind of figure out by tinkering and using those self-help walkthroughs. If you want something a little bit more intensive, they have what they call Basecamp. This is a bunch of videos that they've put together that walk you through a lot of things that you can do with their platform. It also walks you through some how-tos, how to minimize survey fatigue or bias, things like that. So it's a good resource just for other instructional information about how to do surveys. And then lastly, that's just how to get in touch with their support. Their customer support is very responsive. They usually are pretty involved. So the first response may seem a little bit not as great as you want it the first time. And so you just need to push back one more time and say, that really hasn't answered my question. I've got this follow-up. And then they get more intense with you. If needed, they can log into your account to look at what's going on with your actual survey, take a look at the logic and the branching. They do need your permission to do that. So it's not like they can just access your data or your account willy-nilly, but they will take a hands-on approach with you to figure out what's going on in your specific situation. Other resources, us. DMAC and the Center for Human Services Research, we offer survey assistance, we do study design, we do instrument design and review. So if you've already designed an instrument and you want us to take a look at it, that's something that we do. We also help with survey implementation, which can be putting it into Qualtrics, it could be distribution, could be helping with the distribution of incentives. We also do data analysis and reporting stuff. So people can contact us and get a free consultation. You can get a couple hours of our time to do a review of an instrument. But anything more labor intensive than that, we do charge a fee for our services. So you would get a quote from us at that time. We don't use one obvious per hour fee. It's really based on the project that you have and what you need from us. So it's on a project by project basis for our full services, but definitely reach out to us if you have some basic questions too. We're happy to answer those without having to go into greater depth or talk about fees. You can reach us at dmac@albany.edu, or you can check out more about us on our website here at albany.edu/chsr/dmac. And we honestly look forward to hearing from you guys. I especially love survey questions. It's a big part of my job, so I'm hoping that I get to hear from a few of you after this. So are there any questions? And if not, just a heads up, thank you. And here are the email addresses for Margaret and myself.